Yeah, they seem to be much, much more tight-lipped today, Connell, in
Yeah.
terms of just the vibe from the sheriff. He gave a lot more information yesterday. We were actually able to just walk up to the house, and we just got some new video, which I'm hoping to get to you soon. But it's pretty disturbing when you get up to the front door of the house, Connell. You can now see blood, like a blood trail coming out of the front of the house. Which is something that we're seeing for the first time now that the crime scene is cleared. We could get a little closer. And the other thing we noticed, which I had reported earlier, is that the ring. Here we go. This is the new video. Look at this closely, Connell, because this is the first time that we're seeing this. But you can see right there. See the blood? There's blood outside the front door very clearly.
6 months ago, deputies walked up to a front porch in the dark and found blood. They looked at it. They photographed it. And then, according to a new Wall Street Journal investigation, they decided it probably had nothing to do with the woman who had just vanished from inside that house. That was the assumption, made in the first hours, before anyone understood what this case was about to become. We know now that they were wrong. Testing later confirmed that blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. Detectives now believe it came from her being hurt during the abduction itself, which means the single most important physical trace of what happened to her was sitting in plain sight on her own front step from the very beginning. But that's not the part that should worry you, because of what happened to that porch next. There is a second thing buried in the Journal's reporting, something the department had available to them in those exact same first hours, something described by sources inside the office as their most valuable search tool. It sat unused. Nobody deployed it. Nobody has fully explained why. We're going to get to that. And there's a reason all of this matters right now, 6 months later, instead of being a footnote about a chaotic first night. Because the evidence that did survive, the evidence labs are still working on at this moment, has hit a wall of its own. A wall that looks a lot like a consequence. 2 men who were detained during this investigation and released without a single charge are now demanding millions of dollars from the sheriff who runs it. 2 ransom notes have been released to the public that tell 2 completely different stories about whether Nancy is alive.
Just into CNN, authorities in Arizona have released the full contents of 2 notes allegedly sent by Nancy Guthrie's purported abductors to a news outlet in Arizona. The first note came from someone who claimed to have her. It said, quote, "She is safe but scared." And it said that she would not be released until $4 million was paid in Bitcoin. The second note was directed at the Guthrie family, and it claimed that Guthrie had died. Nancy Guthrie was last seen on January 31st, 6 months ago.
And there is a masked figure on doorbell footage that nobody in 6 months has been able to name. So here's the question this video is really about. Not who took her, not yet. Was this case ever given a fair chance to be solved? Let's start on the porch.
There are not a lot of lights on here in Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood. That's on purpose to accommodate the observatories in the mountain ranges. Remember, police believe Nancy Guthrie was taken in the wee hours of Sunday morning between the darkness and the dense desert vegetation. Police have said they don't hold out a lot of hope that home security cameras would catch anything useful.
Understand what the first responders were dealing with. A woman gone from inside her own home. No body, no obvious struggle that anyone could immediately interpret. Neighbors gathering, radios going. That specific kind of chaos where nobody yet knows if this is a wandering off, a domestic situation, or something far worse. And in the middle of that, there was blood on the porch. According to the Journal's reporting, the initial read from investigators on scene was that it wasn't a big deal. The working assumption was that it was unrelated to her disappearance. Sit with that for a second. Unrelated. A woman is missing from her house, and there is blood at the entrance to that house. And the first instinct is that those 2 facts are not connected. Later testing settled it. The blood was hers, and the current investigative theory is that she was injured during the abduction. That this is physical evidence of the moment it happened. Not a coincidence, not an old cut, not a neighbor's dog. The moment. This is the only confirmed physical trace we know of that ties a violent act to that specific address.
Let's first take a look at the blood images. The first one is this image. It's a wide shot of the blood spatter on the doorstep. What does that tell you when you look at it?
Well, it tells a story of a snapshot of time. There's low velocity blood spatter, there's medium velocity blood spatter, and then there's on the right-hand side you see a blood smear. That means somebody impacted that blood after it hit the floor.
Stepped on it.
Stepped on it, rubbed an arm or a hand through it, something like that.
What do the blood drops tell you?
Well, the bigger droplets tell us that because there's no directionality, that they were dropped almost directly from above. But the smaller droplets tell a different story.
Which is what?
Well, they're actually medium velocity blood droplets, which means that they were coughed out. They were aspirated and then coughed out. And I know that because some of these blood droplets, you can see they're sort of rings rather than the whole solid droplet. And that meant that they hit the ground as a bubble. They had air in them. And that can only happen when somebody coughs or sneezes out blood.
Everything else in this case, the ransom notes, the mixed DNA, the footage, carries questions attached. The blood doesn't. The blood is the one thing that got answered, and it nearly got waved off. Now, to be fair, and this video is going to be fair even when the facts are ugly, investigators make judgment calls on scene constantly. Not every stain is evidence, not every detail is connected. A house is a place where people live, and people who live in houses get scraped, cut, and bruised without anyone abducting them. Reading a scene wrong in hour one is not automatically misconduct. But here's what forensic professionals will tell you about hour one. It's the only hour you get. Every decision made in that window shapes everything that follows for months, sometimes years. What gets photographed? What gets swabbed? What gets roped off? And what gets released? Evidence that is disturbed once cannot be undisturbed. There is no version of this work where you go back next week and recollect what was standing there on the first night. Investigators are trained to treat every inch of ground as potential evidence until proven otherwise. Not the reverse. Not assume it's nothing until something tells you it's something. So the question isn't whether one early assumption was wrong. Assumptions get corrected all the time. The question is what that assumption caused. Because if you've decided the blood on the porch probably isn't part of the crime, what does that tell you about how you're going to treat the porch itself? The Wall Street Journal's investigation highlights something that people who have followed this case have been circling for months without full confirmation. The crime scene was not secured. Not was secured and later released on a reasonable timeline. Not was cordoned while the perimeter shifted. The porch, the exact ground where Nancy's blood was found, became freely accessible. Reporters walked up to it. Delivery people walked up to it. Effectively, anyone who wanted to approach Nancy Guthrie's front door could approach Nancy Guthrie's front door. And there is a detail here that most people missed at the time, and it should stop you cold now that you know the sequence. The reason you have ever seen images of that blood spatter at all, the reason those pictures exist in the public record, the reason a news outlet was able to broadcast the first images of it, is that a reporter was physically standing there. On the porch, at the door, close enough to photograph the evidence. That footage wasn't leaked out of an evidence locker. It wasn't obtained through a source in the department. It was obtained because the scene had been cleared and a journalist simply walked up like anybody else could. Think about what that means in practical terms. Every person who stepped onto that walkway after the release brought something with them and took something away. Shoe treads, fibers, skin cells. Every footfall on ground that might have held a partial print, a dropped item, a trace of whoever came up those same steps that night, carrying enough force to leave a woman's blood behind. You cannot unwalk a walkway. So the questions raised by reporting and by outside experts comparing this case against standard forensic protocol are not small ones. Did teams collect everything they should have before handing that property back to normal use? Was the ground photographed and swabbed to the standard of violent abduction demands? Or to the standard of a scene someone had already decided probably wasn't the crime scene? Did investigators walk paths that later turned out to matter, destroying trace evidence just by stepping where they shouldn't have? Nobody can answer that now. That's the entire problem. The window closed. And I want to be precise about what is and isn't being claimed here, because this case has enough noise in it already. These are questions raised by journalists, by former investigators reviewing what's publicly known, and by comparison against how scenes like this are normally handled. They are not findings. No court has ruled on any of it. No internal review has been made public that resolves it. But once questions like these exist, they don't go quietly. They sit underneath every later development in the case, coloring how the public reads every new piece of evidence that comes out, including everything you're about to hear. Because if the handling of that porch were the only issue, you could call it a bad call under pressure, one mistake made fast in the fog. It isn't the only issue. This is the part of the Journal's reporting that has done the most damage inside the department, and it's the loop I opened at the start. The report cites department sources describing a resource, the office's most valuable search tool, that sat unused during the crucial first hours after Nancy went missing. Not delayed, not deployed late in the day, unused in the window when a missing person is most likely to still be findable. I'm not going to guess at what that resource was, and you should be suspicious of anyone covering this case who tells you they know for certain, because the reporting as it stands does not spell it out. What it establishes is the fact of it. The department had a capability. The capability was the most valuable one they had for exactly this kind of search. And in the hours that mattered most, it stayed on the shelf. Which forces the obvious question: why? The Journal's answer, or at least the context it provides, is not about resources or logistics. It's about the man running the office. Department sources quoted in the investigation portray Sheriff Chris Nanos as petty, as someone out for revenge against his rivals. The reporting describes what happened after his re-election victory. Deputies who had backed his opponent found themselves sidelined. Now put those two things next to each other. On one side, the most closely watched missing person case in the country entering its most urgent hours. On the other, an office described by its own people as preoccupied with who was loyal to whom. The Journal does not draw a straight line between those two facts and say, one caused the other. I'm not going to draw it for you either. But I don't have to. You're already making the connection, and so is everyone else who has read that reporting, including, presumably, the people inside that building. And there is more friction in this story than just internal politics. There are reports of tension between the sheriff's office and federal investigators. The FBI brings resources, technology, and experience that most local departments simply do not have, particularly for a case involving a possible kidnapping, ransom demands, and potential interstate implications. That's exactly the profile of this case. That's exactly when a local agency wants federal capability in the building. But partnerships between local and federal agencies don't always run smoothly. Jurisdiction questions, communication gaps, disagreements over who controls which piece of the investigation, and who gets to decide what happens next. Reporting suggests that kind of friction developed here. Tension over how information was shared, over who controlled what, over how decisions got made during those critical early days. Neither side has offered a full public account of what happened behind those doors, which leaves everyone outside piecing it together from sources, leaked fragments, and carefully worded official statements. And layered underneath all of it sits a quieter concern that may be the most consequential of all. Experience. A complex disappearance like this one demands specialized skill, the kind built over years of handling high-stakes, high-pressure investigations where every early decision compounds. Questions have surfaced about whether the local teams initially assigned had that specific background, or whether they were learning critical steps in real time, while the evidence sat outside, exposed to weather, to foot traffic, to time itself. Because here's what nobody could see coming in those first hours, and here's why all of this matters far more than it might sound. The evidence that did survive that opening stretch, the evidence labs are still working on right now, 6 months later, has run into a problem of its own. And it's a problem that gets worse the more people have touched a scene. For months, there was a hair sample. Investigators recovered biological evidence from inside the home, and the hair was the piece everyone put their hope on. It felt like the strongest lead in the entire case. It's the kind of evidence that ends investigations. You find it, you test it, you get a profile, you get a name. That's how people expect it to work. Labs tested it carefully, everyone waited, and it produced no usable DNA profile. No match, no partial, no direction to point in, nothing. Months of waiting, months of a family being told that science was working on it, and it ended with nothing solid to hold on to at all. For a family already worn down by uncertainty, that news landed exactly as hard as you'd imagine. But the case didn't stop there, because deputies had recovered something else, something messier. A second sample, and this one isn't clean, it's mixed. Sheriff Nanos has said that mixture may hold DNA from as many as 4 different people, all tangled together in one sample. Multiple labs are now working to pull those profiles apart, strand by strand, trying to isolate whoever left something behind that night. Which brings us to the question sitting at the dead center of this entire investigation right now. If the DNA is there, why can't anyone say whose DNA it is? Most people picture DNA evidence as a vending machine. Investigators find a sample, it goes in a machine, a name comes out. That is not how this works. Not when several people's genetic material is layered in the same place. Picture a crowded room where 4 people are talking over each other at once. You know sound is there. You can even tell there's more than one speaker. But writing down exactly what each individual person said, word for word, without mixing up who said what, that takes real work. That's the problem forensic scientists are facing here. Or try it another way. Imagine mixing 4 different colors of paint into one jar. Then imagine being asked to separate that jar back into the original 4 colors, perfectly, without losing a single drop. That's roughly the task. Except instead of colors, they're separating genetic strands that can look nearly identical unless examined with extreme precision. Investigators aren't waiting for one clean profile to appear. They're trying to pull several people's genetic material apart from a single tangled source. And that process takes a kind of patience that crime shows have trained an entire generation not to expect. Real labs do not solve mixed samples in a day. Sometimes it takes weeks, sometimes months. Every strand has to be examined, compared, and sorted before scientists can even begin asking whether one of those profiles belongs to whoever came into that home. This is where genetic genealogy would normally enter the picture. It's the technology that has cracked cases nobody believed could be solved. Investigators upload a DNA profile into genealogy databases, the same kind ordinary people use to trace family trees, and search for relatives of an unknown contributor. It's the method that identified the Golden State Killer after more than 40 years of silence. It has closed files older than some of the investigators working them. But genetic genealogy works best on clean, single-source DNA. Feed it a tangled mixture, and the results become far less certain. The individual profiles hiding inside that mixture have to be separated first. Only then can genealogy tools start looking for matches. And every extra person mixed into the sample makes that separation harder, slower, and more prone to error. 4 potential contributors doesn't mean 4 times the work. It means untangling overlapping genetic signals that can look almost the same unless you examine them with extraordinary care. One small mistake sends investigators chasing entirely the wrong lead. There's also the question of who those 4 people even are and why their material ended up in one place. Some of it could belong to Nancy herself. Some could belong to family members or visitors who had every legitimate reason to be inside that home. And some, possibly, could belong to whoever took her. Separating the strand that belongs to an innocent person from the strand that belongs to a suspect is exactly the painstaking work that has kept this part of the case crawling. And none of this is unusual, even though it sounds it. Crime scenes are almost never pristine. People visit homes, furniture gets touched, doorknobs, countertops, porches. They collect traces from everyone who passes through, not just from whoever committed a crime. That's why mixed samples happen so often. It's why untangling them has become its own specialized field. Labs across the country now employ scientists whose entire job is separating exactly this kind of evidence, using software built specifically to model how different genetic profiles combine and overlap. That software runs probability calculations, testing thousands of possible combinations to determine which mix of profiles best explains what was collected. It's less like flipping a switch and more like solving a puzzle where the pieces change shape depending on how you arrange them. And even after the computers finish, human experts still have to review the results carefully before anyone treats them as reliable enough to search against a genealogy database. That extra caution exists for a reason. Genetic genealogy has occasionally led investigators toward the wrong person, especially in its early years, when the techniques were newer. There are reported cases where hasty conclusions pointed toward relatives of the actual contributor rather than the contributor, creating confusion and, in a few instances, wrongful suspicion. The people working this case know that history. It's likely part of why they're moving carefully instead of pushing results out the moment initial data appears. But hold on to this, because it's the thread that runs through this entire video. Doorknobs, countertops, and porches collect traces from everyone who passes through. Every additional contributor makes the separation harder. Now, go back and remember who was allowed to walk up to that front door. If you're following this case closely and you want the next development the moment it breaks, subscribing helps more than you'd think. This story is moving in 3 directions at once right now, and the pieces don't stay connected for long. Because while scientists work on separating strands in a lab, another storm has been building outside of it. One that has nothing to do with hair samples or genetic profiles. And it just changed the shape of the criticism aimed at this investigation. Up until recently, almost every complaint about this investigation was about pace. Not enough progress, not enough answers, 6 months, and no suspect. That's changed. 2 men who were detained during this investigation and released without charges are now pursuing a legal claim against the sheriff's office. Carlos Palazuelos was detained in February. He was then released without explanation. Daniel Maddox was also detained during the investigation and also released without charges. Palazuelos and his family have filed a notice of claim seeking $3,250,000. The claim alleges wrongful detention and defamation and references reputational and property-related harm connected to how they were treated. It names the sheriff and a detective involved. I need to be extremely clear about something, and I'd ask you to actually hear it rather than let it slide past. Neither of these men has been publicly connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance by any confirmed evidence. Not one piece. They were looked at. They were released. Nothing has ever tied them to what happened to her. Their argument is not that they were suspects who beat the case. Their argument is the opposite, that they were harmed by being treated as suspects when the basis for it wasn't there. And their position deserves to be heard properly because it points at something people rarely think about until it happens to them. They say their names were dragged through public suspicion without proof strong enough to justify it. And they argue that the damage from that suspicion doesn't just evaporate the moment charges never get filed. Reputations don't reset. Neighbors remember. Headlines stay searchable forever. For people who were never charged with anything, that kind of lingering suspicion can follow them for years, long after investigators have quietly moved on to a different lead. Now, the other side of it, given fairly. Investigators rarely detain or question anyone without at least some reason to look closer, even when that reason later turns out to be mistaken. Tips, surveillance patterns, digital records, witness statements, any of those can point at someone who ultimately had nothing to do with a crime. That's not automatically wrongdoing. Sometimes it's just an investigation following a lead that didn't pan out, which happens in cases far simpler than this one. And legally, this is a steep hill. Experts following claims like this note that wrongful detention cases are difficult to win. They require showing that investigators lacked a reasonable basis for what they did, not simply that the detention later proved unnecessary. An investigator can follow every proper procedure and still end up detaining someone with no connection to the crime. Proving it went beyond that requires evidence the public hasn't seen, and may not see for a long time. Sheriff Nanos hasn't publicly detailed the reasoning behind those detentions, citing the ongoing investigation and now the pending claim against his office. That silence is understandable. It's also the entire problem. Without it, nobody outside that building can judge whether the decision was sound or whether the claim has teeth. Public reaction has split down predictable lines. Some see it as overdue accountability, the idea that law enforcement should face real consequences when investigative decisions cause lasting harm to people never charged with anything. Others see opportunism, suggesting the case's national attention created a payday regardless of whether investigators acted reasonably at the time. Neither reaction settles the underlying facts. But here's why this claim matters more than two men seeking compensation, and why it belongs in a video about a porch. It doesn't sit separately from everything else. It connects directly back to it. If investigators were working with limited experience, under enormous public pressure, while coordination with federal partners was strained, that is exactly the environment where mistakes involving individual people become more likely. Not because anyone intended harm, because that combination of conditions produces error. And if those detentions were wrong, the cost isn't only to the men who were detained. It's time. Time spent looking at people who had nothing to do with it, while whoever actually took Nancy stayed exactly where they were. Around the 6-month mark, authorities did something that tells you a great deal about where this investigation actually stands. They released the full text of 2 alleged ransom notes to the public. Think about what that decision means. Releasing raw text like that is not a routine step. It's a signal that other paths toward identifying the writer had likely been exhausted, and that investigators were now asking millions of strangers to become part of the investigation. The 2 notes could not be more different from each other, and that difference is the whole point. The first note claims Nancy is alive. It demands $4 million, paid in Bitcoin, with a clear deadline attached. It's businesslike, transactional, and it contains specific details about her home, details someone without inside knowledge might struggle to know. The second note tells a completely different story. It claims Nancy died shortly after being taken, and the tone shifts entirely. It reads as almost apologetic, distant from the cold demand of the first message. So why would the story change that dramatically between 2 messages? There are a handful of possibilities, and none of them are simple. Maybe the writer panicked, realized a ransom scheme built around a living hostage had become impossible to sustain, and rewrote the story once that reality set in. Maybe 2 different people wrote these notes, each with a different motive, a different level of knowledge, a different relationship to whatever actually happened. Maybe the second note was an attempt to end the ordeal, out of guilt, out of fear of being caught, or out of some genuine desire to stop misleading a family. Or maybe both notes are elaborate fabrications, written by someone with no connection to the disappearance at all, extracting money or attention from the chaos around it. Each possibility carries a different weight for the investigation. If one person wrote both, then the shift in tone and story is itself evidence, a window into their state of mind, and possibly their identity. If 2 people wrote them separately, that raises a genuinely frightening question about how many people might know what happened to Nancy. And if both are fake, then investigators are dealing with someone who saw a woman's disappearance and treated it as an opportunity. This is where those specific details in the first note become critical. It mentions Nancy's smartwatch. It references a floodlight that was destroyed around the time she disappeared. It includes information about her home that matches what's actually there. These are not generic details someone could improvise from watching the news. They are specific enough to suggest the writer either witnessed what happened or received information from someone who did. And that distinction is everything. Investigators have to separate someone who genuinely knew what happened from someone imitating a kidnapper after reading coverage. Media reporting on this case has included a great deal over 6 months, giving anyone with an internet connection material to work from if they wanted to build a convincing fake. Which is exactly why investigators hold certain facts back. It's standard practice. Withholding specific details lets them test anyone who confesses or claims knowledge, because only someone genuinely involved would know things that were never made public. It also protects the case from false confessions, which happen far more often in high-profile cases than most people realize. Investigators haven't confirmed which details in these notes fall into that protected category, and they shouldn't. The moment they do, the test stops working. Beyond the content, there's the language itself. Investigators have turned to linguistic analysis, examining word choice, sentence structure, and phrasing patterns across both notes. This has solved cases before. People have writing habits they don't know they have. Certain phrases, certain rhythms, certain ways of building a sentence. It functions almost like a signature, distinct enough that someone who knows the writer personally might recognize it instantly, without being able to explain why it feels familiar. That is precisely why the full text went public. Somewhere out there, someone may read those notes and recognize a way of speaking they've heard before. From a coworker, a neighbor, a relative, an acquaintance who never seemed capable of anything like this, which raises a genuinely uncomfortable thought. Could the person who wrote those messages already be known to someone following this case from home, scrolling through coverage with no idea they're holding a piece of it? There's one more piece, and it makes everything else harder to accept. Doorbell footage reportedly captured an armed, masked figure near Nancy's home around the time she disappeared. Authorities have repeatedly appealed to the public for help identifying this person, releasing footage and descriptions, hoping recognition might come from someone familiar with how this individual moves, dresses, or carries themselves. Now hold that next to the DNA. The genetic evidence gives investigators an invisible suspect, someone whose biological material may exist inside a sample already sitting in a lab, but whose identity is locked behind scientific complexity. The camera gives them a visible one, someone whose actual image was captured in real time, moving near that house during the exact window that matters most. Two completely different forms of evidence, biological and visual, and neither one has produced an identification. That is strange when you stop and think about it. They may have this person's DNA. They may have this person's image. So why don't they have this person's name? That contradiction is the thing that makes this case so maddening to follow. The pieces exist, the connection between them doesn't. And some observers have raised a possibility that would explain part of it, while making everything else worse. What if the masked figure and the person who wrote those notes aren't the same individual at all? Cases like this sometimes attract a second party. Once coverage spreads widely enough, someone completely unconnected to the crime sees an opportunity to extract money or attention from a tragedy already unfolding in public. If that's what happened here, then investigators aren't just solving a disappearance. They're separating real evidence from fabricated noise layered on top of it by someone with no connection to Nancy at all. Every hour spent on the fake is an hour not spent on the real. So lay it all out. Blood confirmed on the porch, initially treated as unrelated. A crime scene released early enough that reporters and delivery drivers could walk to the front door. The department's most valuable search tool, unused in the hours it mattered. A sheriff described by his own people as focused on settling scores. Friction with federal partners over control and information. Questions about whether the first teams had the experience the case demanded. Then the consequences. A hair sample that gave back nothing. A mixed DNA sample possibly holding 4 people, still being pulled apart strand by strand. A masked figure nobody can name. 2 contradictory ransom notes. 2 men detained and released, now demanding millions, and asking a question nobody in that department seems eager to answer. And underneath every single one of those threads, the fact that makes them urgent instead of academic. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. Here's the strange truth about this investigation. The problem may not be a shortage of evidence. By most measures, they have more than many cases ever generate. Blood, DNA, video, written communications, witness accounts. What's missing is the connection, the thing that turns a pile of separate pieces into one chain leading to one name. Right now, those pieces sit apart from each other, each raising its own questions without answering anyone else's. And the reason that connection is so hard to make may trace back further than any lab report. It may trace back to a porch, in the first hours, when someone looked at blood on the step of a missing woman's house and decided it probably didn't matter. That decision has never been undone. It can't be. Somewhere in that tangled sample might be the exact answer everyone has been searching for, or it might end the same way the hair did, months of waiting, followed by silence. Meanwhile, the lab work continues. Quietly, one strand at a time, scientists comparing markers, rerunning tests, cross-checking combinations before declaring anything certain. It's slow, unglamorous work, nothing like the version television sells. But it's the only path that turns a sample into a name, and a family keeps living inside the waiting, watching every headline for a sign of progress, bracing for the next disappointment. 6 months changes how a family experiences an ordinary day. Hope doesn't disappear, it just starts. Sharing space with exhaustion and with questions that never quite stop running in the background of everything else. If this case matters to you, stay with it. The pressure that has actually moved this investigation forward has come from people refusing to let it fade. And subscribing means you'll see the next development when it happens, not months after. Because the question at the center of all of this hasn't changed since the first night. Not who wrote the notes, not whose DNA is in the mixture, not whether a sheriff mishandled a scene. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Until someone answers that, everything else is just evidence in search of a conclusion. A final note: nothing discussed in this video has been proven in any courtroom. The criticisms of this investigation come from published reporting, department sources, and outside analysis, not from confirmed findings. Sheriff Chris Nanos and his office maintain that the investigation has followed proper procedure given the complexity of the case. Carlos Palazuelos and Daniel Maddox were released without charges and have not been connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance by any confirmed evidence. Their claim has not been decided. This video is commentary on publicly reported information, and every individual named is presumed innocent.